Uh,
We are live on YouTube.
Okay.
Namo Namaha, and very good evening to all of you. So, at the inauguration of our Center for Hindu Philosophical Studies, we have arranged this seminar, and to wish us good luck, we have 3 international scholars participating in this session. The first person is Professor Dr. Graham Schwed. The second person is Professor Dr. Kiyokazu Okita. And the third scholar is Professor Dr. Ravi Gupta. So at the beginning of this session, let me have the privilege of welcoming and introducing Professor Dr. Graham Schwed. So Professor Dr. Graham Schwed is currently the Professor of Religion and Director of Studies in Religion at Christopher Newport University in Virginia, as well as a distinguished research and teaching faculty at the Center for Dharma Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Professor Schwed did his graduate studies at the University of Chicago and Harvard University and earned his doctorate in comparative religion from Harvard. His scholarly specializations are Hindu traditions and Vaishnava Bhakti, the philosophy and history of yoga, love mysticisms, and the comparative theology of religions. Among his published books is Bhagavad Gita, the beloved Lord's secret love song, published by HarperCollins, and Dance of Different Love, the Bhagavatam's Rasa Leela of Krishna, published by Princeton University Press. He is currently working on his translation of and commentary on the Yoga Sutra to be published by Yale University Press. So on behalf of the University of Mumbai Center for Hindu Philosophical Studies, I extend a warm and hearty welcome to Professor Dr. Graham Schwed, and I request him to begin his talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Narsaleh, and it's nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and happy to be here among all the scholars in this session and in this conference. So what I'll do is I'm going to be sharing my screen most of the time here, but before I start with that, I should say, in my talk, Arjuna's Broken Heart, Mining Hidden Philosophical Gems in the Bhagavad Gita. Why do I say hidden? Well, I say hidden because I think that the Bhagavad Gita has, in some sense, eluded people in several ways, either because the teachings are very complex in such a small text. They're either complex or because the narrative mixed with the teachings and how they are seen as disintegrated, whereas I really feel it's a very integrated text. And then others still, things remain hidden because they're not doctrinally convenient to recognize for particular schools. So I'm trying to look at the Bhagavad Gita today through some sort of essential messages of the Gita. So let's start by sharing my screen. Okay. So let's see here. Oh, good. It's a pleasure to see Professor Okita here. Good to see him. Good. I recognize one other face here, so that's nice. Okay, so here we are with the beginning slide, and again, mining hidden philosophical gems. And I say gems because there are such powerful and evocative messages in the Gita that I feel still attracts the world, since this Gita is one of the 3 most read sacred texts in the world. And we're going to look at that. Publishers always ask me to put this copyright thing here. And then this is the description. Before I get into the sort of substance of what I want to say, we're talking about philosophy, and typically, as we all know, philosophy is the word in English that we use to translate darshana. Darshana. Philosophy means something a little different, coming from the Greek, the love of wisdom, literally the love of wisdom, philosophia, right? The nature of knowledge and existence, and so on. Darshana adds something to this. Darshana means showing, seeing, experiencing. And then, of course, other connotations are shared between the meanings of darshana and philosophy. So today I want to talk a little bit about the seeing, what we can see is occurring in the Gita, what is being seen within the Gita, and so forth. So I want to talk about maybe sort of, I guess my talk is sort of loosely structured among 8 themes. The human condition, and this is an intentional order. I think it mirrors something of the order in the Bhagavad Gita text itself. The human condition, the nature of the outer world, the subtle teaching on ethics, the nature of the self, the nature of the innermost world, the vision of ultimate reality and the divine calling and the divine embrace, and a short conclusion. Okay. So the 3 most read sacred texts in the world are clearly the Bible, which is number 1, with about 31,000 plus verses. The Quran, with over 6,000 verses. And our little Bhagavad Gita, only 700 verses. Only 700 verses. But you know what I'd like to point out is not the difference in terms of size. I'd like to point out the difference in terms of the way these 3 texts, or actually 4, if you count the Bible as having New Testament and the Hebrew Bible itself. The way they start, the way they launch is so different. The Western texts, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran similarly present themselves in a way. The book of Genesis says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light.'" Very cosmic, very much the divine acts of God, very much identifying God right at the start. Gospel of Mark, same thing. In the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Again, front-loading, if you will allow me to use that somewhat cruder term, front-loading immediately divinity, divinity's identity, divinity's divine acts, and here as Jesus Christ. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, referring back to the Hebrew Bible, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way." So in a way, it's drawing from the Hebrew Bible, bringing it into the present New Testament. And again, this identificatory information right up front in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament. And again, the Gnostic words of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Again, so much attention to divinity right at the start, without delay, right at the start. Okay, and now the Quran. Look at the Quran. Beautiful, the Shahada passage, right? Glory to Allah Most High, full of grace and mercy. So the attributes of God are being placed here. He created all, including man. To man, he gave a special place in his creation. Again, front-loading divinity, identity, acts, and attributes. Bhagavad Gita. We all know how it opens up. Dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta yoyotsava mamaka pandavaschaiva kimmakuravata sanjaya. On the field of Dharma, on the field of Kuru, assembled together, desiring to fight were my armies, and indeed those of the sons of Pandu. How did they act, O Sanjaya? To the Western reader, how is this a sacred text? It doesn't sound like a sacred text from what we're used to in the West. But this is the genius of the Gita, I would like to assert here. The genius of the Gita is that it front loads not God, not the identity of God, not the attributes and actions of God, but the human condition. And this is universal. The human condition. What culture, what civilization isn't confronted by the human condition? By front-loading God and the divine identity and attributes and acts and so on, you are immediately identifying as a community of faith. And whether or not the reader is part of that community of faith. With Bhagavad Gita, you're immediately front-loading the human condition. I feel this is the genius of the Gita. It's beautiful, but it's subtle. And again, mining the hidden gems, okay? So there's a troubled outward seeing that immediately is offered in the first chapter. Troubled outward seeing. Remember, darshana is seeing. So let's talk about seeing. Now seeing the armies of the Pandavas arrayed in battle formation. And I just happen to have a very nice little painting here of it. So I look upon those about to engage in battle. So again, seeing is very much part of the human condition, and troubled seeing at that. Filled with deep compassion and falling into despair, spoke the following words: seeing my own relations, standing nearby ready to fight. My limbs are sinking down, and my mouth has become very dry. Also my body trembles, and the hairs of my limbs stand on end. So Arjuna is collapsing. He is brokenhearted by what he sees. This is how the Gita launches. There are no divine acts here, ladies and gentlemen, as we know. We're all here very familiar with the Gita. But I must underscore this, how it begins with the human condition. And this is so universal. I perceive, again, seeing, troubled seeing, signs of chaos, terrible reversals. And again, I foresee no benefit in slaying my own relations in battle. This troubled seeing. Now, later on in my talk, we're going to see outward seeing, true outward seeing, and true inward seeing. And of course, later, we can actually approach people who see truly, knowers of the truth, the guru. Okay, let's look at this. The Gita wastes no time in offering the reader exactly what it's about if one can read in a positive way, eisegetically, into the text. The first word, dharma, on the field of dharma. But read into it, dharma, on the field of our true, permanent inner nature. Okay? On the field of our true, permanent inner nature. And as we know in chapter 13 and 14, the kshetras, the kshetra gya, that we are known, souls are known as kshetra gyas, knowers of the field, or entities that are aware of spheres of interaction. We have spheres of interaction. That is a kshetra. So on the field of our true permanent inner nature, dharma kshetra. Then on the field of kuru, reading more deeply into it, kuru, on the field of our outer conditioned impermanent nature. As we all know, the Kuru dynasty is the dynasty from which all the warriors on the battlefield come. And that's a conditioned circumstance. So, ladies and gentlemen, Kuru, our conditioned outer nature, Dharma, our true inner nature. These two fields, samaveta, yoyotsava, they come together in conflict. What the Gita shows, what the Gita's whole project is to show that yoga is to bring these two fields together in perfect harmony. So right in the first 4 words, we've got the juxtaposition of our outer conditioned nature and our inner true nature. And these come together in tension, in conflict. And it is the Gita's project to bring these together in harmonious practice within yoga. The original title of the first chapter is quite, it stands out among all the other chapter titles that are traditionally added to the Mahabharata chapters. Arjuna Vashadha Yoga. Yes, it's really the outer and inner conflict. Arjuna's yoga of despondency, his yoga of despair and hopelessness. And this, again, characterizes the human condition. Arjuna is standing in for the rest of us. So, the human condition in chapter 1, Arjuna's ethical dilemma, and this is the outer world of conflict, the conflict that is around us everywhere, interactive confrontation, Arjuna's confusion in thinking, cognitive dissonance, the conflictual inner world, what's going on the outside, what's going on the inside, now becomes a precipitated challenge. And then ultimately, Arjuna's shattered heart, despair and despondency, affective disorder, and this inmost shattered world of the heart. This is the way the Gita begins. But then, as we know, in chapter 2, he turns to Krishna in this pivotal verse where Arjuna states, "My very being is afflicted by a piteous weakness of spirit." This anticipates bhakti. My thoughts on dharma are completely bewildered. This anticipates jnana. I ask you, tell me, what is definitely better for me? In other words, what is better for me to do? This anticipates karma. Then, shishyasteham shadimam aham prapanam. I am your student. Instruct me, for I have offered myself unto you. So this seventh verse in the Bhagavad Gita is very pivotal in moving out from the conditioned state in which Arjuna found himself. Okay, let's go to the second theme, the nature of the outer world. Well, we've already seen these four items, these four themes in the first chapter: the outer world of conflict, conflictual inner world, shattered innermost world. But the Bhagavad Gita states that this phenomenal world is a very mixed world. Mixed with the beautiful and the ugly, the light and the dark, the good and the bad, the just and the unjust, happiness and unhappiness, peacefulness and stressfulness, love and fear, peace and war, health and sickness, kindness and hatred, and it goes on, nourishment and starvation, birth and death. Finally, birth and death is what it really adds all up to. At the same time, this world allows the divine to pierce through it. Toward the end of chapter 10, Krishna states, whatever form of existence possesses abounding power, contains the beautiful, or is well endowed with excellence. Understand that every such form has become fully manifest, but a part of my splendor. So this world, yes, being so mixed, yes, but it has the ability to reveal a little spark of the divine. The subtle teachings on ethics. Well, we already saw this verse. I look upon those about to engage in battle who are here to please the evil-minded Dhritarashtra. So on the one hand, Arjuna is, getting ready, attaining a mindset as a warrior, as a kshatriya. And this is his nature, to engage in battle, to, if necessary, to protect the innocent. But on the other hand, he sees his own relations on the other side, the opposing side, as we've seen. So his conflict is whether to fight, whether to not fight. There are points in the first chapter where he says, I think I'd rather have the enemy kill me, because what is the use of living in a world where everyone I love is gone? What is the point? So the last line, the fourth quarter verse of the very first verse of the first chapter, is something that confronts all of us if we are sensitive enough to the issue. Kimakurvata Sanjaya. How do we act in a world of conflict, pain, and suffering? As privileged as all of us here are, as fortunate as all of us here may be, the world is covered, blanketed with so much suffering. How do we act in such a world? So this irresolvable conflict, ethical conflict in the Gita, shows it has in and of itself a tacit ethical teaching. And this, again, we need to mind this, because it doesn't come right out and say this, but it ultimately does express this, that this world, this outer world, will always have conflict. It will never be without conflict. And any of us here have lived long enough, can see that is really true. But the idea is that this outer world will always have a conflict, and the teaching of the Gita is that it will never be resolved at an ethical level. Ethical challenges will never be resolved or dissolved. Yes? Oh, okay, I'm going to continue, okay? Okay.
उनका नंबर दे दूं क्या आपको?
Maybe you need to mute. Yeah. Okay, very good. Okay, good. So the teaching here, the tacit teaching of the Gita is that to resolve ethical dilemmas in the outer world will never be resolved at the outer world level, that one has to go within. As Krishna says to Arjuna, be a yogi. Move within. Only you can resolve and solve this issue in the outer world in yourself. It will never be solved at the outer world level. That is not to say that we shouldn't try. That is not to say that we shouldn't pursue all intent for a peaceful resolution. But it says that ultimately it will never be resolved at that level. It will only be resolved in oneself. And this is where Krishna takes Arjuna. This is his teachings, where Krishna takes Arjuna on this journey into yoga. By the end of the first chapter, he is completely brokenhearted at this challenge. Oh, I meant to show, yes, has a shattered heart. He is plagued by a shattered heart. Oh, this thing, it doesn't belong here. I don't know. The nature of self. Let's move to the nature of self. Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, I am giving you a little, smattering of these themes. These themes go very, very deep into the Gita. And in a mere 45 minutes, I'm not going to be able to cover even one of these themes thoroughly. That's why, of course, I teach in the university whole courses on the Bhagavad Gita, where I can do that. But again, what I'm trying to show here is that the philosophical gems of the Gita need to be mined carefully. So the nature of the self is beautifully shown in the example of Sanjaya, the narrator, at the very end of the Gita, where he explains Vyasa Prasadat Shrutavan. By the grace of Vyasa, I've heard this supreme secret of yoga from Krishna, the supreme Lord of yoga, appearing directly before my eyes, speaking at himself. So you see how vision and sound work together powerfully in the Hindu philosophical tradition and a religious tradition. As the very dramatic ending of the Vedanta Sutra says, Anavrati Shabdat. Anavrati Shabdat, repeats twice, which is very dramatic. But on account of Shabda, there is no returning to this world of birth and death, the cycle of birth and death, to samsara. So, directly seeing before his eyes. Okay, so this is what Sanjaya's example is. The irony is that Arjuna is seeing Krishna right before his eyes, but he's not seeing him. Why? Because the conditioned state blocks our view of the greater reality in front of us. This is the Gita's teaching. True inward seeing. And upon striving, yogis see that self which exists within the self. But those who are not self-actualized, even though striving, cannot see this because being unthoughtful. So there are many verses that express this, but in the interest of time, I have to move along at a much more rapid clip. One who sees me everywhere and sees all things in me. To such a person I am never lost, nor is such a person ever lost to me. Again, ladies and gentlemen, seeing, darshana, philosophy. This is what the Gita is about. This is really, truly what the Gita is about. True outward seeing is expressed. one who sees by comparison to oneself, the same in all beings, etc. I desire to see your supremely powerful form, Arjuna says. Again, the desire to see comes forth from Arjuna. And Krishna says, you're not able to see me in this particular form. So I'll give you divine eyes to see. This theme of seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is powerful in the Gita. Very, very powerful. And of course, this is what he sees. But the problem is, again, the way the Gita has been interpreted, even by the venerable Richard Charles Zahner, formerly of Oxford University in the mid-20th century, he writes at the start of the 11th chapter in his translation of the Gita that this is the climactic portion of the Gita. And I say wrong. It is anticlimactic, because he ultimately says, there's much seeing here, of course, of the Vishwarupa, no doubt. Okay, but he says, not by the Vedas, sacrifice or study, nor by giving in charity, nor even by rites, nor by severe austerities, am I able to be seen in such a form within the world of humans. But then he says, you may now behold my very intimate form. And he says that this is very rarely seen, and this is the most valuable form. What is right before Arjuna was there all the while he could not perceive it in his conditioned state. And it's more valuable and more precious than even the Vishwarupa. So the 11th chapter is anticlimactic. Professor Zahner, I believe, is wrong. So again, we have to do philosophical mining, of these gems. Okay. Yes. None other can be this. It's right there in 1154. So this is, he's right in the last verses, how precious this form is what is being shown there. Okay. The nature of the innermost world. Heart. First, we learn about the shattered hearts on the field of Kurukshetra. Shattered hearts. The word heart appears only 10 times in the Gita, whereas in the Bhagavata Purana, it appears 420 times. Now, of course, I don't need to tell everyone here, the Bhagavata Purana is many, many times longer, but the word heart plays an important role, needless to say, in the Gita. In chapter 2, faint-heartedness, hridaya daurbalyam. Okay, faint-heartedness is again part of the conditioned state. But we learn that abiding in the heart in whose is the sword of knowledge. So that within the heart of the conditioned soul is the possibility of fighting one's way out with the sword of knowledge. And then we learn that the innermost heart of all beings, the divine, is within the innermost heart of all beings. We learn that it's possible to stop the mind from within the heart. Krishna is dwelling, divinity is dwelling within the innermost heart, and so on, with their hearts set upon me. The divine is seated in the heart of everyone, and so forth. Very powerful theme. The Supreme Lord of all beings, O Arjuna, is present within the inner region of the heart. Okay. The vision of ultimate reality in the divine. Well, we need to speed up here, ladies and gentlemen, but I need to simply tell you that the Bhagavata's manifestations are embracing the conditioned souls all the while, but yet the conditioned soul cannot see these manifestations as embraces. The divine all around us, the Vishwarupa. Infinite being, the divine everywhere without. The personal presence of the divine deeply within. So the divine deeply within, without, and all around us. 7, the divine calling and divine embrace. Now, normally, we think of Krishna as the flute-playing Lord, calling souls to his heart with his beloved Radha. Well, how is he doing this in the Gita? Well, he's obviously not playing the flute on the field of Kurukshetra. This is no place to play a flute, okay? And the flute would not even be good as a weapon. You need other things besides a flute, okay? But amazingly, this underlying, undergirded theme where Krishna expresses how souls are dearly loved by him. Can you guess how many times he expresses this? No fewer than 10 instances. You are so much loved by me in this climactic verse in the 18th chapter. And I've gone into this extensively in my translation and commentary of the Bhagavad Gita. So I won't go into it much here. But what's important for us to acknowledge that there is a loving universe embracing conditioned souls that they cannot see. And yet the divine is always calling them, either with the flute or the teachings here, or these expressions. Come to me, Krishna says. Do you know how many times Krishna says or expresses his desire for souls to come to him? Can anyone guess? 22 instances. Ladies and gentlemen, if you get a text message on your phone that's once or twice or even 3 times, it's pretty insistent. 10 times would be terribly insistent. 22 times. This is the essence of the Gita. Conditioned souls to wake up to the nature of a loving universe is what the Gita is about, I would proffer. Yes, truly you shall come to me, for you are dearly loved by me. 1865. And then what I want to show all of you before closing is I want to show you how this kind of literary structure of the Gita is truly extraordinary. The first chapter I've divided up into the conflictual outer world, I believe verses 1 through 19, the conflictual inner world, a bunch of middle verses, and the shattered innermost world. And then, of course, this leads the reader into the 16 following chapters. The 18th chapter can be easily divided up into 3 sections. The Great Secret, verses 1 through 49. The Greater Secret, and these are not my terms. These are the terms of Krishna in the Gita, found in 1863. So the Great Secret, verses 1 through 49. The Greater Secret, 14 more verses, the 14 following verses, up through 63. And then the greatest secret of all. And they correspond to the outer world, inner world, and innermost world conflicts. They're the answer to the first chapter. The great secret, to act out of one's essence, dharma, to take up one's dharma in this world, whether that means varna, whether that means acting from your own, acting from your heart, to take up a life, the very life for which you were designed. This is dharma. Inner world, the greater secret, the conflictual inner world. Well, this is the world ultimately that can resolve the outer world conflicts if one achieves pure transcendence and a realization of the true self. The true seeing, inward seeing and outward seeing is the true self. And then finally, this shattered innermost world of the heart is addressed by divinity, trying to draw all souls to his loving heart. Yeah, here it is. And then the concluding words. And you see that I've outlined the great secret here, and in the first part of the 18th chapter, and it can be subdivided in these various ways, which we don't have much time to go into now. And then the greater secret, transcendence and the supreme self, Brahman and Purusha. These can be, again, further subdivided, the great secret, into these breakdowns. And then finally, the greatest secret of all, divine love and a divine yearning. And this is seen in just 3 verses, 64 through 66, explained here. The irony is that in the great secret, Krishna is saying, take up dharma in this outer world. But when you come to me, Krishna says, relinquish all forms of dharma, because in divine love, dharma is something that you go beyond. And yet you retain it at the same time. Okay, and then the concluding words. So my conclusion, to wind up here, my conclusion is, of course, what we saw this verse earlier. My conclusion is the example of Sanjaya. We are to hear this supreme secret of yoga, Guhyam Param Yogam, by hearing it and enter into the grace of Vyasa, who allows us to hear this great dialogue, this great conversation. And thus ultimately be able to see before our own eyes reality, the ultimate reality, the big picture beyond our little, possibly very painful pictures at times, but to be able to see the big picture, to see divinity embracing us from without, from within, and all around us. Yoga, then, as I've defined it, is the return embrace of the divine. Plain and simple. It can get very complex how that takes place, but plain and simple. The divinity is embracing us at these 3 levels. Yoga is the return embrace. I'll just end by going to Western philosophy. Maybe that's a taboo here, but why not end on what Blaise Pascal says? We know truth not only by reason, but also by the heart. I think that's where the Gita goes. Thank you.
Beautiful and very intense, thought-provoking talk. And so I hope that the audience has appreciated. I'm sure. Why should I hope? I'm sure. I'm confident that the audience has appreciated your thoughts. And I like the analysis. So on one hand, it was a statistical analysis. On the other hand, it was a deep philosophical analysis. So it is a very nice blend of both. So I'm very thankful to Professor Graham Schweik for delivering this talk. It is 6:45 and we have with us Professor Kiyokazu Okita. So I think we can keep the questions at the end of the session. So this will help us to manage the time. So thank you very much, Professor Graham Schwed. And we have with us now. Thank you. So Professor Kiyokazu Okita, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we have with us Professor Kiyokazu Okita, who is just a minute. So Uma madam.
Yeah, tell me.
Now we should have the screen of Professor Kiyokazu Okita. So it is not happening.
Can you see him?
Professor Okita, please start your video.
He is already made as a host.
Yeah, Professor Okita, please start your video.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
and the yeah, so shall I just start? Can you see?
Yeah, we can see.
You.
We can see.
Yeah, we can see, and I have to introduce you. So, Professor Okita, very good evening. Professor Kiyokazu Okita is Associate Professor of Hindu Studies at the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Sophia University, Tokyo. He is also a research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, where he leads together with Dr. Nance Bro and Dr. Rembert Hans, an international collaborative research project, the Goswami Etira, the founding of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in early modern South Asia. In his current research project, Okita examines a complex relation between devotion, that is Bhakti, aesthetic delight, that is Rasa, and ethics, that is Dharma, in Chaitanya Vaishnavism. His publications include Hindu theology in early modern South Asia, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2014, then Rejecting Monism, Dvaita Vedanta's Engagement with the Bhagavata Puran, Journal of Indian Philosophy 2020, and also the authorship of the commentary on Vopadeva's Harilila in the Journal of Indian and Buddhist Studies 2020. So we are very glad to have such a erudite scholar with us. So on behalf of University of Mumbai and the Center for Hindu Philosophical Studies, I extend a warm and hearty welcome to Professor Kiyokazu Okita, and I request him to begin his talk.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? Is it okay?
Yes, very much.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Madhavinalaslai, for this kind invitation. I also like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to join this auspicious occasion of the establishment of the Center for Hindu Philosophical Studies at the University of Mumbai. And thank you all the audience for participating, and then I especially like to greet my colleague Professor Schweig for being here, and then also for your very wonderful presentation. I had a lot of questions I wanted to discuss with you, but then I guess due to interest of time, I think I should keep my questions for later. My name is Kiyokazu Okita, and today I'd like to celebrate this auspicious occasion for this founding of the center by speaking about two medieval thinkers, namely Vopadeva and Hemadri, who hailed from no other place than the Maharashtra, where the university is located. Okay, so I would like to proceed in a way by reading out this paper. Okay, So introduction. The idea of Bhakti Rasa, or let's say the title of my paper is Making a Case for a Bhakti Rasa, Bopadeva Hemadri's engagement with the Natya Alankara tradition. Introduction. The idea of Bhakti Rasa, or the aesthetic sentiment of devotion, flourished in South Asia in the early modern period. There appeared the works such as Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Madhusudana Saraswati's Bhakti Rasayana, Priyadas Bhakti Rasa Bodhini, and so on and so forth. In the tradition of the Natya and Alankara, however, it was not always obvious that Bhakti can be rasa in some ways. Therefore, tracing the origin and the development of the concept of Bhakti Rasa is a significant task in unpacking the early modern works and how they may relate to the Sanskrit aesthetic theories developed in the medieval period. As Hamza Steinson points out, the earliest attestation to the use of compound Bhakti Rasa are found in the stotras of Kashmir Shaiva poets. These are the Stavachintamani, written by Bhattanarayana, and the Shivastotravadi by Utpaladeva. These poets use the expression Bhakti Rasa in their devotional hymns, mainly to describe the ambrosia-like quality of devotion devotees experience towards Shiva. These occurrences of the compound, especially those in Uppaladeva's work, are significant as they indicate awareness of rasa in the sense used in the formal aesthetic theory. However, neither of these authors nor Kshemaraja's commentaries on these works articulates Bhakti Rasa in a systematic, coherent manner using the technical terms provided in the Natya Shastra. Moreover, as we see below, Abhinav Gupta, the most famous among the Kashmirian thinkers, and the following him, a Jain author Hemachandra, explicitly rejected Bhakti as rasa in a formal sense. It is in this context that Bopadeva and Hemadri occupy a place of prominence in the history of Hindu thought. They were the first thinkers to offer systematic and sustained discourse on Bhakti Rasa, articulating the concept using the technical terms used in the Natya Alankara tradition, and consciously arguing against the earlier rasa theoreticians such as Abhinav Gupta. Bopadeva and Hemadri both lived in Maharashtra in the 13th century. Bopadeva is better known for his work on grammar called the Mukta Bodha, but he also authored 2 books on the Bhagavata Purana called the Muktapada and the Haririra. Hemadri is most well known as the author of Chaturvarga Chintamani, an encyclopedic work on Dharma. For our purpose, however, we will focus on his Kaivalya Deepika commentary on Bopadeva's Muktapada. He was a patron of Bopadeva and served as a minister to successive Yadava kings, Mahadeva and Ramachandra, at the court of Devagiri from 1260 to 1309. In this presentation, first I discussed Dandin's Kavya Darsha, which provides one of the earliest views on devotion within the Alankara tradition. Then we examine the views on devotion in Abhinav Gupta's Abhinav Bharati and Hemachandra's Kavya Anushasana and so on. And according to Abhinav Gupta, devotion is an element of the peaceful aesthetic sentiment, Shantarasa, while according to Hemachandra, it is a type of delight. Rejecting these views, Bopadeva and Hemadri argued that devotion can be rasa. In the last section, I examined Bopadeva's Muktapada and Hemadri's Kaivalya Deepika commentary. Hemadri argued for the legitimacy of Bhakti Rasa and explained why he believed Abhinav Gupta and Hemachandra were wrong. Hemadri also rejected Bhoja's view on rasa as well. So moving on to section 1. Within the tradition of Alankara, the earliest reference to the idea of devotion is found in Dandin's Kavya Darsha. Dandin first provides a verse that describes Vidura's utterance towards Krishna. "O Govinda," I quote, "that love which I experience today when you came my home, I would experience this same love only when you come back," unquote. Commenting on this verse, Dandin states that Vidura's speech pleased Hari, who is properly worshipped only through devotion. This suggests that for Dandin, the concept of love is synonymous with the idea of devotion. Immediately following this, Dandin cites another verse which describes a certain king called Raja Varman's love towards God, and comments that we should understand Raja Varman's love to be a kind of affection. So in this way, Dandin treats devotion, love, and affection synonymously. However, there is no discussion as to whether or not we can consider any of these to be a rasa. Section 2, Bhakti in Abhinavagupta. The first place within the Natya Alankara tradition where we find a clear view on devotion is Abhinavagupta's Abhinavavarati. As is well known, Abhinavagupta accepts only 9 types of rasas, culminating with the peaceful. For him, devotion is not a rasa, but merely a component within the 9th rasa of the peaceful. In his discussion on the peaceful rasa, Abhinavagupta identifies aesthetic elements to be renunciation, the fear of transmigrative world, and so on, reactions to be contemplation on soteriological text, transitory emotions to be dispassion, sagacity, remembrance, satisfaction, and so on. Then Abhinavagupta states that devotion and faith are not distinct rasas because these two are the peaceful rasas components which follow transitory emotions such as remembrance. In short, for Abhinavagupta, devotion is comparable to transitory emotions, and as such, it is only an element within the peaceful rasa. So here you can see the Abhinavagupta's analysis of how peaceful rasa arises. And according to him, this bhakti devotion is just one of the many Vyabhichari bhavas. Okay. So the point is that according to Abhinavagupta, bhakti is not a distinct rasa or independent rasa as such. Abhinavagupta mentions devotion elsewhere in the Abhinavabharati. He notes that according to some Alankarikas, attachment or sneha or the greediness, laulia, are independent rasas in addition to the 9 well-established ones. Abhinavagupta rejects this view, arguing that attachment can be included in the stable emotion of fear, desire, determination, while greediness within the stable emotion of amusement or desire. Abhinavagupta does not consider attachment and greediness to be rasas because one of the 9 accepted stable emotions can account for them. After this discussion, Abhinavagupta states, I quote, "We should speak about devotion in the same manner, evam bhaktao api bhajyam," unquote. This suggests that according to Abhinavagupta, devotion too should be subsumed under one of the existing 9 stable emotions. He does not clarify which stable emotion may account for devotion. However, given his earlier reference, we can assume that he would subsume it under dispassion, knowledge about reality, or tranquility, which can be the stable emotion for the peaceful rasa. So here is another analysis by Abhinavagupta where bhakti might fit. So this Purva-Pakshin argued that other than this 9 well-established, well-accepted rasas, there are other rasas like sneha, which has tenderness as sthai bhava, or the laulia, which has garuda as sthai bhava, and so on. So that's the Purva-Pakshin's view. But Abhinavagupta says, well, this attachment, if it is from child to parents, then it can be a form of fear, which is an interesting analysis, I think. But in any case, or if this attachment is from friend to friend, then that could be rati. And if this attachment is from one brother to another brother, like from Lakshmana to Rama, then it could be a type of utsaha. Okay, so in this way, there is no sneha as a distinct rasa as such. And similarly, Abhinavagupta argues that the laulia could be subsumed under hasa or rati, and therefore there is no need to create this laulia as an independent rasa. And he says bhakti is the same way, which probably means that the bhakti could be, again, subsumed under shanta. So moving on to Hemachandra, basically he follows Abhinavagupta. Following Abhinavagupta, Hemachandra also views the devotion is not the rasa. However, unlike Abhinavagupta, who subsumed devotion under the peaceful rasa, Hemachandra does so under erotic rasa. In Kavya Anusashana, Hemachandra lists the 9 rasas starting with the erotic. In his auto-commentary called Alankara Chudamani, Hemachandra states that sentiments such as attachment and greediness are not rasas because they can be included within one of the 9 stable emotions, and the same applies to devotion as well. This exactly follows Abhinav Gupta's discussion above. In the Viveka, another auto-commentary, however, Hemachandra states that devotion is a type of desire, which is stable emotion for the erotic rasa. Thus, while following the framework of Abhinav Gupta's discussion, Hemachandra offers slightly different insight as to where devotion may fit within the context of rasa. So again, Hemachandra offers slightly different analysis, but the point is still the same. That is, this bhakti or devotion is not rasa as such, but it's a type of rati, which is a staibhava for the Sringara rasa. Okay, so there is no bhakti as a rasa. Okay, so now finally we come to Bhopadeva and Hemadri. It is against these backgrounds that Bhopadeva and Hemadri argue that devotion is rasa. Bhopadeva's Muktapala is a systematic commentary on the Bhagavata Purana, and Hemadri's Kaivalya Dipika is the commentary on the Muktapala. In the 11th chapter of the Muktapala, Bhopadeva first provides the general definition or Samanya Lakshana of devotee, citing Bhagavata 6.119. According to the verse, a devotee is someone who directs his or her mind towards Krishna. Then Bhopadeva states that there are 9 types of devotees based on the kind of rasa they experience. I quote, so this is Bhopadeva. This devotee is of 9 types because the aesthetic sentiment of devotion, bhakti rasa, in fact is experienced in the form of comic, erotic, tragic, violent, fearful, macabre, peaceful, fantastic, and heroic, unquote. As far as I'm aware, this is the first place in the history of the Hindu thought that the compound bhakti rasa appears clearly in relation to the 9 rasas of the Natya Alankara tradition. Bhopadeva's statement above is significant in 2 respects. First, through this statement, Bhopadeva deliberately argues against Abhinav Gupta and Hemachandra, who state that the bhakti is not rasa. Commenting on Bhopadeva's statement, Hemadri explains, I quote, it, i.e. devotion, becomes aesthetic sentiment, rasa, when it reaches the highest limit of excellence, unquote. If we follow Hemadri, then we can probably understand bhakti rasa to be a karmadharya compound, meaning a devotion that is aesthetic sentiment. It is important to note that according to Hemadri, the difference between bhakti and bhakti rasa is a matter of degree, but not of kind. Thus, Hemadri's view on the relationship between stable emotion, that is staibhava, and aesthetic sentiment, that is rasa, is similar to that of Bhatta Lolata. This is further evidenced by the fact that Hemadri cites from Rudra Bhatta's Sringara Tilaka, which states, I quote, precisely these stable emotions become aesthetic sentiments when they are fully developed, unquote. In other words, Hemadri does not follow Abhinav Gupta on this point, who makes a sharp distinction between daily experience and aesthetic experience. Furthermore, although Hemadri does not state explicitly, his statement also suggests that bhakti is a stable emotion, staibhava, for bhakti rasa. Another point to note in Bhopadeva's statement above is that it explains the relationship between bhakti rasa and the 9 types of rasas such as hasya and sringara that are traditionally accepted. According to Hemadri's commentary, hasya and other rasas become bhakti rasa when they are fixed onto the Lord. What this means is that in Hemadri's system, the 9 kinds of traditional rasas are subsumed under bhakti rasa as its aspects or modes. In other words, according to Hemadri, bhakti rasa is a meta category for the traditional 9 rasas. So here we see this 8 types of staibhava, which is actually, I'm sorry, the 9 types of staibhava, which is a sort of traditionally accepted by Abhinav Gupta, Hemachandra, and so on. And these standard staibhava is the basis for the 9 types of rasa, hasya, shringara, and so on. But according to Bopadeva and Hemadri, this bhakti and bhakti rasa, they are the kind of meta category. They are the sort of larger category which underlie these 9 stable emotions and the 9 aesthetic sentiments traditionally accepted. Okay. So this kind of hierarchization of the concept of bhakti and the Staibhava and bhakti rasa to other rasas, this hierarchization is the point. So furthermore, what is absolutely unique in Hemadri's commentary is his characterization of 9 rasas based on the Triguna theory. This is something which we do not see in Bopadeva, nor in any earlier rasa theories. According to Hemadri, the first 3 rasas, that is Hasya, Shringara, Karuna, mentioned by Bopadeva are based on Rajas, the middle 3 on Tamas, and the last 3 on Sattva. Within this tripartite categorization, Hemadri accounts for the distinction of each rasa by explaining that they're mixed with other gunas. Thus, for example, the aesthetic sentiment of devotion in the form of comic is mixed with Sattva, that of erotic with Tamas and Sattva, and that of tragic with Tamas, while all 3 are rooted in Rajas. So this sort of guna-based analysis is absolutely unique in Bopadeva Hemadri's analysis. So these 9 rasas, which are the aspects of a bhakti rasa, are categorized into Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. And then these are further sort of individuated by mentioning this sort of mixture with of Rajas with Sattva, of Rajas with Tamas and Sattva, and so on. Okay, and this categorization is actually inspired by the Bhagavata's discussion, which you see in 12th book in 25th chapter. Hemadri justifies this application of the guna theory to Bopadeva's bhakti rasa theory by referring to Bhagavata 11:25. In this section, Krishna teaches to Uddhava how various mental states arise from 3 gunas. According to Krishna, from sattva arise mental states such as tranquility, sense control, and so on. From rajas, desire, effort, and so on. And from tamas, anger, greed, and so on. This section of Bhagavata has nothing to do with the topic of rasa. However, some mental states, such as tranquility and desire mentioned in the Bhagavata, do overlap with some of the stable emotions and aesthetic sentiments. Therefore, Hemadri's Triguna-based categorization of the 9 rasas is his attempt to integrate into the Bhagavata theology the traditional rasa theories established by Abhinav, Gupta, and others. And this process of integration, however, remains somewhat incomplete since we do not find 2 of the 9 aesthetic sentiments, that's Vibhatsa and Atta, accounted for in the list of mental states mentioned in the Bhagavata. So if you look at the mental states mentioned in these 3 verses in the Bhagavata 11:25, then you see the mental states such as Shama, Kama, Hasya, Utsaha, Kuroda, Shoka, and Bhi, which can easily, you can sort of correlate with these 9 types of rasas. But then it seems the Bhagavata passages do not have the mental states that corresponding to this Vibhatsa and Adbhuta. So that's where this sort of inconsistency remains. After providing a general definition of devotees and their 9-fold categorization, Bopadeva defines what bhakti rasa is. I quote, so this is going back to Bopadeva. The aesthetic sentiment, I quote, the aesthetic sentiment of devotion is astonishment, chamatkara, which is produced through listening and so on of the exploits concerning Vishnu or Vishnu's devotees, the exploits that Vyasa and others describe, which consist of 9 aesthetic sentiments, unquote. According to Hemadri's commentary, Bopadeva offers this definition of Bhakti Rasa in response to Abhinav Gupta and Hemachandra. Hemadri argues that we should not reject Bhakti Rasa because it has the necessary components, samagri, for it to be rasa. In this context, the necessary components refer to the standard set according to Bharata's Natya Shastra, namely aesthetic elements, reactions, transitory emotions, and stable emotions. Hemadri identifies each element that constitute Bhakti Rasa. I quote again, a stable emotion is the settling of mind on Krishna by any means. Stimulant factors are listening and so on of the exploits of Vishnu and of his devotees. And foundational factor is Vishnu's devotees. As for reactions, they are being paralyzed and so on. And transitory emotions are satisfaction and so on, which will be spoken of according to the appropriate context. As for means, they are desire, amusement, and so on. So this is just a chart based on what Bopadeva says. So you can see this Thai Baba, Uddipana Vibhava, Alambana Vibhava, and so on, all accounted for. But then interestingly, Bopadeva adds this upaya. So this settling of a mind on Krishna by any means is a reference to Bhagavata 7.132, which states, I quote, King Vena would not be any among those 5 types of people who maintain strong sentiment towards the primordial one, i.e. Vishnu. Therefore, one should place mind onto Krishna by any means, unquote. According to Bhagavata 7.130, by absorbing the mind onto the Lord through lust, hatred, fear, affection, and through devotion, many remove their impurities and thereby attain liberation. Bhagavata 7.131 then states that the gopis adopted lust, kamsa, fear, shishpala, hatred, the Vrishnis, affection, and Narada and others, devotion. According to the Bhagavata, King Venu went to hell because he could not direct his mind towards Krishna by any of the 5 emotions. Although they do not exactly match, the 5 emotions mentioned in Bhagavata 7.130 partially overlap with the 9 stable emotions. For example, we can easily equate lust in the Bhagavata passage with desire, the hatred with anger. As for fear, it is counted as a stable emotion already. So therefore, when Hemadri says that the means refers to the 9 types of stable emotions, such as delight, amusement, and so on, one way to look at this is to understand this as an attempt to expand the number of soteriologically viable emotions from the 5 in the Bhagavata to the 9 of the rasa theory. It must be also noted, however, that the affection and devotion mentioned in the Bhagavata do not have clear counterparts within the 9 stable emotions. Thus again, Hemadri's attempt to develop Bhagavata theology with the use of traditional rasa theory remains incomplete or even inconsistent. So this is correspondence between 5 emotions mentioned in the Bhagavata and 9 stable emotions. After listing these components, Hemadri states that if one still rejects Bhakti Rasa, even when all the necessary components are present, such a person is merely lacking appetite to enjoy literature or dharma with devotional theme. If the opponent rejects Bhakti Rasa on the basis that not everyone experiences it, then Hemadri responds that any rasa is experienced only by those who have appropriate latent dispositions, vasana. For example, Hemadri points out that the peaceful celibate students do not experience the erotic rasa. Presumably, this is because they do not have the stable emotion of desire or rati, which is a necessary component for experiencing rasa of erotic. Likewise, in the case of Bhakti Rasa, those who do not have devotional inclination towards Krishna or Vishnu will not experience it because they do not have the necessary stable emotion. Hemadri's point is that the fact that some people may not experience Bhakti Rasa is not the reason to reject it. Thus, he concludes that Bhakti Rasa exists for sure. After concluding his argument against Abhinav Gupta and Hemachandra, Hemadri deals with Bhoja's view. In his Saraswati Kanta Varana, Bhoja argues that there are more than the standard set of 9 rasas. According to Bhoja, there exists the agreeable rasa with affection as its stable emotion, and the noble rasa with esteem as its sthāyi bhava, and vainglorious rasa with pride. Hemadri, however, points out that elsewhere, Bhoja himself lists affection, esteem, and pride as transitory emotions. Then Hemadri argues that it is illogical to accept those emotions to be the stable emotions and to be transitory emotions at the same time. Thus, Hemadri concludes that Bhopadeva's view is correct, which accepts only 9 types of bhakti rasa. So Bhoja in one place says that other than these 9 traditionally accepted rasa, there should be other rasas, that's prayas with the sneha as sthāyi bhava, udata as mati, as sthāyi bhava, and so on. But Hemadri points out that, well, in one place, Bhojadeva says that these are sthāyi bhava for these rasas, but in the other place, he lists the same emotions as a vyabhichari bhava. So you cannot list the same emotions, affection, esteem, pride, as sthāyi bhava and as vyabhichari bhava at the same time. That's contradictory. So this argument offered by Bhojadeva doesn't work. That's Hemadri's sort of rejection. So conclusion, in this paper, we briefly examine the development of bhakti rasa. Although Dandin already refers to the idea of devotion, it is not clear whether he considers it to be a rasa. Then Abhinav Gupta and Hemachandra explicitly state that devotion is not a rasa, arguing that it should be subsumed within one of the 9 stable emotions. Against these earlier authors, Bhopadeva and Hemadri argue that the bhakti rasa is a legitimate aesthetic sentiment because it has the necessary components, such as aesthetic elements. Moreover, they argue that bhakti rasa has devotion as its stable emotion, and that it is a meta category to which the traditional 9 rasas are simply its aspects. The latter point has an implication of expanding the scope of soteriologically effective sentiments from the 5 types mentioned in the Bhagavata. However, they reject Bhoja's view and do not accept more than 9 types of bhakti rasa. Hemadri also applies a Triguna-based analysis to the 9 types of bhakti rasa, an analysis which again seems to be prompted by the Bhagavata. Overall, Bhopadeva and Hemadri were creative thinkers who, for the first time, articulated bhakti rasa as a technical aesthetic concept, consciously incorporating the terminologies of the Natya Shastra and engaging with the earlier rasa theoreticians such as Abhinav Gupta, Bhoja, and Hemachandra. The Bhagavata's rich and complex theology, the rise of its popularity in the late medieval period, and the fluidity within the discourse on rasa probably all contributed to the creation of this Bhagavata-inspired aesthetic theory. However, Bhopadeva Hemadri's bhakti rasa theory remained somewhat incomplete, as the ideas found in the Bhagavata did not always neatly fit with the categories in the traditional rasa theories. It was then perhaps both Bhopadeva Hemadri's creativity and the incompleteness of their theory that prompted the development of new bhakti rasa theories in the early modern period. The early modern authors, such as Rupa and Jiva Goswamis, developed their views on bhakti rasa based on Bhopadeva and Hemadri. Rupa, for example, expanded the number of bhakti rasa further to 12. In his discussion on bhakti rasa, Jiva adopted the idea of rasa's necessary components, rasa samagri. Thus, understanding Bhopadeva and Hemadri is a crucial task in unpacking the development of the Bhagavata-inflected aesthetic theories that flourished in early modern South Asia. Thank you very much. So I finish my presentation here. If that is okay, shall I stop? Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah,
Maybe?
stop sharing, sir.
Okay.
So, Professor Kiyokazu Okita's talk was very intense, and the analysis which he did of Upadeva's commentary and Himadri's commentary, Upadeva's commentary and Upadeva's work and Himadri's work uh, on the concept of bhakti. It's a very important milestone in understanding the nature of bhakti, which was developed in the medieval period in India, especially Maharashtra. So I have been so a thought which triggered in my mind was that there are series of commentaries on Bhagavata Puran in Maharashtra, and these commentaries seem to be contemporary to each other. So there may be some sort of interrelationship between the Sanskrit and the Marathi commentaries on the Bhagavata Purana is something which I want Professor Kiyot to comment on.
Madhuri, Ravi Gupta has also joined, just to tell you.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Professor Narslai. I'm aware that you've been working on the Marathi commentaries on Bhagavata. I must say I'm not familiar with the that genre, that vernacular commentaries enough to comment anything substantial at this point. But I'm here just to say that I think that's a very good point to further explore, since this Bopadeva Hemati came from Maharashtra. So whether there might be some influence of their commentary onto these vernacular commentaries, or maybe other way around, these vernacular commentaries influence on these Sanskrit commentaries. I think that's a very important point to think about. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kiyokazu Okita.
Yeah, in fact, actually, do you see anything, since you've been working on Marathi commentaries? Do you see anything potentially, any relationship between Bopadeva Hemati?
I did not come across as such.
What is the time period, by the way?
The time period is actually, let me see, it's a 13th century.
13th.
Bopadeva Hemati, yeah, both 13th century.
Both are
Yes.
13th.
Yes.
Madhu, you are referring to Jnaneshwari, is it?
No. There are two commentaries. One commentary is by Bahira Jataveda in Marathi on the 10th skandha of the Bhagavata Puran.
Okay.
And there is one more commentary called Harivarada.
Harivarada is famous, correct. Yeah.
So that is also there.
What's the time period of that? Then we may be able to tell what he's...
Bhairavi Tika of Bahira Jataveda is near about 14th, 15th century. There is still it is difficult to place him because we don't see any secondary references also of this
one
author.
Influence the other, we do not know.
Yeah.
But what is the paper, Okita?
To place him.
Yeah, and in fact, whether there is a relationship or not, that's one issue. But then also, if you come across any discussion on rasa in these Marathi commentaries, that's something I really would like to know. So yeah, if you see any discussion on rasa in these Marathi commentaries, that would be also very interesting.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
So, any other question? Okay. The audience is engaged in what you have put forth. That's really nice. So now we will go to the next speaker, Professor Ravi Gupta. Professor Kyo, can you stop the video? Yeah. Professor Ravi Gupta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
You hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much. So, very good evening, Professor. So, let me have the privilege of introducing him to all of us. Professor Ravi M. Gupta is the Charles Red Professor of Religious Studies and Department Head of History, Religious Studies and Classics at the Utah State University. He holds a doctorate in Hindu Studies from Oxford University in England. He is the author or editor of 4 books, including an abridged translation of the Bhagavata Puran with Kenneth Walpay, published in 2017 by Columbia University Press. Professor Ravi Gupta has received 4 teaching awards, the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Fellowship, 3 research fellowships, and a book award. He is a permanent research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and a past president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. He speaks around the world on topics related to Chaitanya Vaishnavism, Vedanta philosophy, and Krishna Bhakti traditions. Over to you, Professor Ravi Gupta.
Thank you so much, Madhavi, for this invitation. Actually, I was really delighted to receive the invitation from Dr. Nasale. It was I was happy to hear about the creation of this new center for Hindu philosophical studies, and my best wishes to the center to flourish in the area of academia. I have to start also, after my thanks to the organizers, my apologies to my colleagues, Dr. Okita and Professor Schweig, for missing their presentations, or most of them. It's quite early in the morning. I decided to log on about 6:30 in the morning here in Utah, where I live, and so I wasn't able to come for the earlier presentations, but I'm thankful to the organizers to have mine a little bit later, so it becomes a better time for me. It's also for that reason, if there's other presenters here, that I'm not attending other sections of the conference. Those portions are very much in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:30 for me. And so the timing with India doesn't work out exactly right. We are here in Utah, Utah State University, where I teach. We're 12 and a half hours behind Indian Standard Time here. So again, my apologies to Professors Okita and Schweig. I look forward to reading your presentations in my own time. So thank you. So I have, my presentation is called, Can Empirical Observation Influence Scriptural Testimony? Would it be useful if I shared my screen like Kyo did?
Yes, sir.
Or should
Please.
Yeah, okay. Give me. Okay. So can empirical observation influence scriptural testimony? Is everyone able to see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. An exploration through Jiva Goswami's Sarva Samvadini. And by empirical observation, for those who are Sanskritists, you'll know I mean here Pratyaksha, and by scriptural testimony, I am referring to Shabda. So can Pratyaksha influence Shabda, and exploration through Jiva Goswami's Sarva Samvadini? This paper explores the question, what is the relationship between scriptural authority and empirical knowledge in Chaitanya Vaishnava theology? In particular, what happens if revelation and empirical observation do not agree with each other? Can sensory perception influence the interpretation of scripture? Vedanta philosophers have agreed that the most reliable means of acquiring valid knowledge, that is Pramana, is Shabda, namely verbal testimony, and in particular Shruti, the scriptural authority of the Veda. The Veda is regarded as being without human author, Paurusheya, revealing knowledge about matters that are beyond the purview of the senses. In the words of Jiva Goswami, a 16th century Chaitanya Vaishnava theologian, verbal testimony can overrule sensory perception, pratyaksha, and logical inference, anumana, since both of these are susceptible to misapprehension. Thus, Shabda conveys ultimate truth, Jiva asserts in his Sarvasambhadini, whereas the other Pramanas are reduced to mere shadows. At first glance, this can appear like a one-way street. Shabda can correct and overrule Pratyaksha, but Pratyaksha has no influence on our understanding of Shabda, which is eternal, self-evident, and divinely revealed. Empirical observation becomes, at best, a means to confirm the claims of Scripture, if it is not to be ignored altogether. A closer study of Jiva Goswami's Sarvasambhadini, however, reveals a much more nuanced and dynamic relationship between Shabda and Pratyaksha, where each actively influences the other. This paper will suggest that Jiva Goswami creates space for empirical knowledge to coexist with scriptural testimony, and to a limited extent influence how we interpret Scripture. But first, we ought to clarify some matters of method. This paper is an attempt at constructive theology, a rereading of an early Chaitanya Vaishnava author, Jiva Goswami, whose views are foundational and perpetually relevant for Chaitanya Vaishnavas. Taken together, the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan created a corpus of Sanskrit literature that was regarded as definitive by the later tradition, even as later theologians elaborated and reinterpreted the Goswamis' views to address communal and political needs in their own times. So Dr. Okita's work is a good example of this later elaboration and reinterpretation. On matters of epistemology and ontology, the youngest of the 6, Jiva, became the standard bearer for later tradition. As Joseph O'Connell puts it, quote, "The theological corpus of the Vrindavan Goswamis covers the whole range of matters considered integral to understanding Krishna Bhakti in the tradition of Chaitanya. Indeed, the completeness of scope and excellence of execution of the Goswamis' theological corpus is such that it established the channels within which Chaitanya Vaishnava theology thereafter would develop. In a sense, the early Goswamis may have been too successful. Their work seems to have discouraged later mainline theologians from striking out creatively in new directions." Clearly, any contemporary Chaitanya Vaishnava theology must take seriously the writings of the Goswamis. At the same time, no tradition can maintain its vitality without striking out creatively in new directions, addressing concerns that arise from new contexts. Parimal Patil says it well, quote, "The challenge for potential Hindu theologians is to maintain the integrity of tradition while attempting to recontextualize it in a context that is, in many ways, intellectually familiar but institutionally new. It is the challenge of forming tradition while continuing to be genuinely formed by it," unquote. There can be few theological concerns as foundational for Vedantic traditions as the role of scriptural revelation. What counts as Shruti and Smriti, and when are they binding on the faithful? Is Scripture inerrant? And when can it be taken non-literally? How do we determine when a particular reading is appropriate? Upon which hermeneutical principles would such a reading be grounded? The questions are numerous, and they have been argued at length by Chaitanya Vaishnava theologians throughout the tradition's history. My attempt here is more limited. I wish to raise a single question in relation to a single theologian. What is the relationship between two widely accepted means of knowing, namely empirical observation, Pratyaksha, and scriptural revelation, Shabda? In particular, can the former guide, modify, or influence how we read the latter? What would be the parameters of such a reading? These questions have obvious significance in a world that is shaped by the empiricist epistemologies of science. I am neither a historian of science nor a philosopher of science. Rather, my attempt here will be to plumb the spaces opened up by Jiva's Vedantic epistemology for a more robust notion of Pratyaksha. As an attempt at constructive theology, this presentation will argue for a more dialogical relationship between the different Pramanas, even if Shabda maintains the upper hand. First, the problem. In his Sarvasamvadini, an appendix to his magnum opus, the Bhagavata Sandarbha, Jiva explains the power and preeminent position of Shabda. I'm going to skip the quote just for the sake of time here, but I summarize what's being said here. Jiva here asserts that Shabda can reveal knowledge that the other primary pramanas, sensory perception, pratyaksha, and inference, anumana, cannot access. And on matters where the two do have some jurisdiction, such as knowledge of the phenomenal world, Shabda can still overrule them. Jiva extensively critiques the absolute reliability of inference and sensory perception, critiques that I think most people would find reasonable, and that need not engage us here. Jiva concludes that Shabda, with its divine provenance, remains the only independent pramana, whereas the others are reduced to shadow-like subordinates. This is a formidable armor for Shabda, no doubt giving pride of place to revelation in Chaitanya Vaishnava Vedanta. However, there are chinks in Shabda's armor, 4 in particular, that allow entry for empirical observation. I will identify and examine these 4 chinks in quick succession. Okay, so the problem is that essentially Shabda seems to have a very overwhelmingly powerful role that could potentially suffocate the other 2 pramanas that Jiva recognizes, namely Pratyaksha, sensory perception, and Anumana, inference. He says in that quote I skipped that Shabda does not depend on any of the others, Pratyaksha and Anumana. And the others can assist it as far as they are able, but Shabda is the only independent means of knowing. So that's essentially the question. But I think there are arguments to be made for a more dialogical relationship between Shabda and the other pramanas, even in Jiva Goswami's own writings. And there are 4 such areas, I think, for a more dialogical connection, a mutual relationship between these pramanas that I would like to point out. The first is what counts as Shabda, the first chink in the armor of Shabda. The immediate question that arises is what constitutes Shabda? Since, as Jiva points out, everyone thinks his own opinion free from delusion, and the other such faults, and that leaves us no way to ascertain the relative value of differing opinions. I'm going to read that again because I didn't read it properly. The immediate question that arises is what constitutes Shabda, since, as Jiva points out, everyone thinks his own opinion free from delusion and the other such faults, and that leaves us no way to ascertain the relative value of differing opinions. The most important instance of Shabda, says Jiva, is the Veda, generated from the Lord himself. But it is striking that Jiva then proceeds to include medical texts, Vaidya Shastra, for they too were written under the direction of the Supreme Lord. One may argue, I quote, one may argue that they, medical texts, are unsanctioned like other works because there is no evidence to prove their authority. But we say, no, we can accept these additional texts as scripture, Shabda, because they faithfully follow the Vedas. Jiva's choice of medical texts is both surprising and promising because medical science in Jiva's time and in ours is an area of knowledge that is fluid and prone to modification through empirical observation. Jiva is likely to have known this. In his study of Ayurveda, Dominic Wojastik points out that, quote, an old tradition of medical debate is very evident in the earliest Samhitas of Charaka and Sushruta, unquote, continuing well into the early modern period, where authors such as Vireshwara in 17th century Rajasthan attempt to mount a serious challenge to the foundational doctrines of classical medicine. At the very least, Jiva would have been familiar with the heterogeneous medical digest, Ayurveda Sokhya of Todar Malla, Akbar's prime minister, who worked closely with the Chaitanya Vaishnavas to secure ownership of the Govinda temple in Vrindavan. Indeed, given Jiva's sudden leap from the Veda to medical texts, he seems to be arguing for a two-tiered understanding of Shabda. In the first tier are those texts that are apaurusheya and thus absolute in their authority, avyabhichari pramanam, including both Shruti, Veda, and Smriti, Purana and Itihasa. In the second tier of Shabda Pramana are those works that derive from trustworthy, apta, but still mundane sources and follow the authority of the Vedas. Interestingly, Jiva uses the word shastratva vyavahara to describe medical texts. In common practice, they have the quality of shastra. This opens up all kinds of interesting spaces in the realm of Shabda. Could the works of other scientific fields, such as engineering, mathematics, biology, and the natural sciences, be included in the category of Shabda as reliable testimony of non-divine origin or even divine inspiration? Could the malleability and broad societal acceptance of such disciplines serve to include them in the category of Shabda Pramana, rather than relegating them to the more suspect realm of Pratyaksha and Anuman? This technical recategorization would have significant consequences because questions posed by scientific disciplines would then need to be resolved using the hermeneutics of Shabda, for example, assessing the relative weight of Shastras or textual criticism, rather than being dismissed as products of a subordinate and fallible pramana, such as Pratyaksha or Anuman. So that's the first chink in the armor of Shabda, and possibility for an opening up of these pramanic categories. The second question I want to raise, the second area where there might be some opening, is with the question, what is the scope of Shabda? This leads us to a subsequent question. What exactly is the domain and scope of each pramana? Jiva states that Shabda is, quote, the most effective in understanding a subject that cannot be touched by the powers of other pramanas. Okay, so I'll repeat that again. Shabda is most effective in understanding a subject that cannot be touched by the powers of the other pramanas, whereas Pratyaksha's authority is in worldly matters, samvyavaharikam pramanyam. This view is not unique to Jiva. In the 5th sutra of the Brahma Sutra, the word ashabdam is interpreted by most Vedantists as the world which can be known by means other than scripture. And yet, Jiva makes it clear that Shabda cannot be confined to the non-material realm. He quotes approvingly from the 10th century Advaita commentator Vachaspati Mishra, quote, this is Vachaspati Mishra speaking, nor is it reasonable to say that when scripture contradicts sense perception, it loses its authority, or else must be understood in a figurative sense. This idea is unreasonable because scripture is self-evident authority, having no human author and being an awakener to knowledge from which all fear of fault has been dispelled. Scripture depends on no other evidence to yield its result, valid knowledge, unquote. Nevertheless, Shabda's autonomy fails to suffocate Pratyaksha's vitality for one important reason. Our ability to perceive and understand scripture depends on sensory perception. Thus, in ordinary situations, Pratyaksha retains its authority, and Shabda's veto power ought to be used only rarely. Quote, scriptural evidence does not defeat the ordinary authority of sensory perception, Jiva says, again quoting Vachaspati. For then scripture would have no cause and would not come into being. Rather, what scripture defeats is the absolute authority of sensory truth. Jiva defines ordinary authority, samvyavaharikam pramanyam, in strikingly broad terms as sarvatrikam, everywhere, or anytime. He then defines Shastra as that which, in particular cases, kvachit, overrules Pratyaksha. So he agrees that this Pratyaksha has broad authority in kind of a generic sense, except in very specific cases where Shastra might overrule Pratyaksha. And what are those particular cases? Or more broadly, when do Shabda and Pratyaksha intersect? If we examine the Sarva Samvadani as a whole, it seems that Jiva allows three spaces for intersection. The first is when Shabda provides a foundation for reliable inference, anumana, by supplementing sensory observation with knowledge from a reliable source. Jiva offers a modified version of the classic example of smoke on a mountain. Whether or not the smoke signals the presence of a bonfire cannot be known from seeing the smoke alone, but a reliable person can direct travelers to a genuine fire. That is a human settlement using his or her prior knowledge of the area. So this is the first kind of intersection where a Shabda provides a foundation or useful information to make a reliable inference that can correct Pratyaksha or broaden Pratyaksha. The second kind of intersection between Shabda and Pratyaksha runs in the other direction. When sensory observation supports scriptural knowledge, he gives a straightforward example. The Taittiriya Samhita states that fire is the antidote to cold, and sensory perception can confirm this. The most interesting intersection of the Pramanas is, of course, when Shabda overrules the others. That's the one that's interesting to us here. But even here, Jiva's examples are tamer than one might expect. He speaks of someone who has been bitten by a snake, but after treatment, the doctor pronounces that the poison has been removed from the patient's system, although the patient may still feel the pain. So here the doctor is functioning as Shabda, and the experience of the patient as Pratyaksha. So the experience says there's still poison. The doctor, Shabda, overrules that and says that the poison is gone. Similarly, scripture states that a limb burned by fire can also be healed, Similarly, scripture states that a limb burned by fire can be also healed by the heat of fire, a statement that seems to defy reason. In total, Jiva gives 5 examples of Shabda overruling other Pramanas, and interestingly, all 5 are related to medical practice. This leads to a significant outcome. While Shabda may overrule one's initial empirical observation, the two means of knowing eventually become congruent. One would hope, for example, that the patient will eventually come to recognize the truth of the doctor's promise that the poison has been removed. Rather than truly overruling empirical observation, then, Shabda seems to be working in concert with it. After all, Shabda is also knowledge that is based on the observation of reliable sources, such as doctors or the sages recorded in scripture. Those more reliable observations serve as catalysts for the rise of reliable observations even in worldly persons, outside the realm of scripture or inspired sages. From this perspective, Shabda's overruling power does not seem so draconian after all. Indeed, the circular character of Shabda that we have uncovered here leads us directly to the next chink in Shabda's armor. How do we know that Shabda is reliable? Even if we accept Shabda's ability to overrule the other Pramanas, How do we know that Shabda is in fact reliable? What is the basis of Shabda's authority? Although the non-human and atemporal origin of Scripture is no doubt important to you, Jiva does not appeal to this fact while arguing for the supremacy of Shabda, presumably because one could simply raise the subsequent question of how one would know that something originates outside human time and perception. Rather, Jiva points to Vaidusha Pratyaksha, the observations of the wise, as the basis of Shabda. The sages through whom we receive the scriptures are capable of directly seeing the truth, and thus their Pratyaksha is our Shabda. And if we press just a bit further, how do we know that the scriptures are indeed observations of the wise and not the misapprehension of fools? Here, Jiva points to our ability to correctly apprehend reality. Shabda's truth is self-evident to human beings. As an example, he offers Shankara's well-known parable of the 10th. 10 men swim across a river, and upon reaching the other side, they decide to count the group to ensure that everyone made it across safely. However, each person counts only 9, and so they begin to grieve for the drowned 10th person. Hearing their cries, the wise man approaches the group and reveals the truth. You are the 10th. He tells the one who counts. As soon as the words of the wise enter their ears, the truth is clear. The words of the wise require no external proof. They are self-evident and a fully independent nairapeksham means of knowing. So how do we know that Shabda is reliable? Jiva's treatment of this question allows us to create a hermeneutical circle. The observations of the wise become verbal or scriptural testimony for worldly persons, whose own capacity for perceiving truth allows them to recognize the veracity of the knowledge they receive. Transformed by that knowledge, such persons themselves, or some of them, become Vaidusha, wise, and their words too can serve as reliable testimony for others. Vaidusha Pratyaksha creates Shabda Pramana, which then transforms the learner's Pratyaksha, opening up the possibility of further Shabda. Indeed, one does not have to look far from Jiva Goswami to find evidence of this hermeneutical circle at play in Chaitanya Vaishnavism. Jiva's uncle and the eldest of the 6 Goswamis, Sanatan, wrote a much beloved work called Brihad Bhagavatamrita. This work is framed as a conversation that occurs immediately after the Bhagavata Purana. When the king Parikshit has completed his 7-day hearing of the Bhagavat Purana and is waiting for his imminent death, his mother Uttara runs up to him and asks him to convey the essence of the Bhagavata for her benefit. That essence takes the shape of the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, spoken by Parikshit to Uttara, but of course written by Sanatana Goswami. The hermeneutical circle is at work here. The Bhagavata Purana is apaurushaya, without human origin, according to Jiva, but nevertheless revealed to humans through Vaidusha Pratyaksha, the observations of the wise, particularly the sage Shukadev. The Bhagavata, as the paradigmatic Shabda for Chaitanya Vaishnavas, deeply transforms Sanatana Goswami, who then expresses his own vision, Vaidusha Pratyaksha, of that truth in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, a work that is therefore new and eternal at the same time. The Brihad Bhagavatamrita then becomes Shabda for followers of the Goswamis, who are themselves transformed by Sanatana's vision and presumably become sources of Vaidusha Pratyaksha themselves. In the generation after Sanatana, one might look to the songs of Narottam as the continued turning of this hermeneutical circle. And so, once again, human observation has much more of a significant role to play in the origin and function of Shabda than we might have at first expected. And finally, what do we do when Shabda seems utterly implausible? We are left now with one final question. What happens when Scripture plainly and obviously contradicts empirical observation. In other words, what do we do when Shabda seems utterly implausible? We are concerned here not with situations where Scripture speaks of matters that are impossible to verify using empirical observation, that is, matters that are truly beyond sense perception, such as the existence of a non-material reality. That is an easier situation, where Scripture offers knowledge that is otherwise unavailable to human beings. Rather, we are concerned here with instances when Scripture speaks of things that can be known through the senses and contradicts that sensory knowledge. Despite his statements of scriptural supremacy, Jiva is not, in practice, eager to do away with human perception as a reliable and straightforward means of knowing. In his examples of Shabda Pratyaksha conflicts, he leads us down a useful path. Limited interpretation, limited reinterpretation of Scripture to resolve the conflict. Perhaps there are instances where one must accept a scriptural statement on faith, despite sensory evidence to the contrary. But if there are such cases, Jiva does not offer us any. Rather, all his examples lead us to reread scriptural statements in a way that aligns them with our own experience, while still remaining faithful to the intent and authority of those statements. Sanskrit literary tradition, these gray areas are things that I thought I would skip if we didn't have time, but I think we do have time, so I'll read through them. Sanskrit literary tradition has long recognized word meanings has long categorized word meanings into three general types: the primary or straightforward meaning, mukhya, the indirect or indicated meaning, lakshana, and the suggested meaning, goni or vyanjana. The straightforward meaning of a word, as known by social convention or etymology, two different ways, is the place to start in one's reading of a passage. But if the straightforward meaning is obstructed in some way, then one ought to propose an indirect meaning that is related to the straightforward meaning. The classic example is Gangayam Ghoshaha, the village is on the Ganga. Since human settlements do not exist on rivers, we must supply something that is unstated in the sentence. The village is on the bank of the Ganga. The key point for our purposes is that the shift from the primary meaning to the indirect meaning is usually prompted by human experience, as in the case of villages on rivers. When applied to Scripture, this has potentially far-reaching consequences. Jonathan Edelman has provided an excellent study of how this hermeneutical method can and has prompted a reinterpretation of Scripture in light of scientific knowledge. In particular, Edelman examines the work of Jnanaraja in the early 16th century, who attempts to reconcile Puranic cosmologies with the scientifically measurable cosmologies of Siddhanta literature. Indeed, Jiva Goswami does not shy away from reinterpreting Scripture in light of conflicting empirical observation. He provides three statements from the Shatapatha Brahmana as examples. The earth spoke, the waters spoke, and the stones float. And in each of these, it is empirical observation that prompts the reinterpretation of Scripture in an indirect way. In the first two statements, which implausibly state that earth and waters speak, Jiva suggests that the text is referring to the gods who control these elements, the devas. In the case of stones floating, Jiva offers a functionalist explanation. Scripture here is praising the stones used in sacrifice to press the soma plant in order to increase their efficacy, as happened in the case of Rama's bridge to Lanka. Implicit in all of Jiva's interpretations is that when Shabda and Pratyaksha conflict, we ought to preserve the authority of both and reject neither. My conclusion. We have examined here 4 challenging questions regarding Shabda. We have examined here 4 challenging questions regarding Shabda. What counts as Shabda? What is Shabda's scope How do we know that Shabda is reliable? And what happens when Shabda is implausible? Each of these questions opens up interesting and productive spaces for a fuller understanding and application of empirical observation, allowing Pratyaksha to not only coexist with Shabda, but to significantly influence how we understand Scripture. No doubt these spaces have important implications for the role of scientific study in relation to Scripture. But more broadly, they create a holistic understanding of human knowledge that resists fundamentalism. The picture that emerges from our exploration of the Pramanas is decidedly dialogical. Shabda and Pratyaksha learn from and spar with one another, without either being thrown out of the conversation. Indeed, if Shabda is grounded in the testimony of the wise, then the wisdom born from careful observation of the world also asks to be admitted to the realm of Shabda. If Scripture influences how we see our world, then sensory perception influences how we read Scripture. If wisdom from Scripture supports and refines our observation of the world, then wisdom gleaned from careful observation can support and refine our reading of Scripture. Conversely, if Scripture can overrule sensory perception, then perception can prompt a reinterpretation of Scripture. And if Scripture creates good human beings, leading them on the path to becoming wise, then the observations of the wise themselves create Scripture. And so I suggest that we move from a steeply hierarchical ladder of Pramanas, and this is the constructive theology part here. And so I suggest that we move from a steeply hierarchical ladder of Pramanas to a more dialogical model, where Shabda is no doubt the senior partner in the conversation, carrying the gravitas of revelation. But human observation and reason are nonetheless consequential participants, taken seriously and never ignored or silenced. What would such a dialogical approach look like in practice? Drawing from Jiva's methods, as discussed above, we can begin with the following three things. First, we read Scripture together with our knowledge of the world. We ask, what do we know about the world that might confirm or problematize our understanding of this passage? Conversely, when we observe the world, we see it through the eyes of Scripture. How does Scripture illuminate or problematize our understanding of the world? So we allow each one to problematize the other and see each through the eyes of the other. Second, if Scripture and empirical knowledge conflict, we do not shy away from the issue. Instead, we ask, how do we honor both? Can Scripture be reread in a way that reconciles the conflict? Conversely, will my observation of the world eventually make sense in light of Scripture? So we don't shy away from conflict, but rather reread Scripture, but also reread the world in light of the other. Third, when we come across sources of knowledge outside Shruti and Smriti, such as wisdom in other religions or in scientific knowledge, we are willing to take them seriously as conversation partners. We ask, are these sources of knowledge reliable in their respective areas of expertise and therefore examples of Vaidusha Pratyaksha? Do they follow the spirit of Shruti and Smriti? If so, what can I learn about these knowledge traditions? And what can I learn about my own tradition from studying these other sources of knowledge? So this third one is about openness to other forms of knowledge that might be admitted into the category of Shabda. And in another paper that's not yet published, I discuss the potential possibility of admitting even scriptural texts from other traditions, other religions or other sampradayas than one's own into the category of Shabda as sort of a broadening of that category. The Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, I believe, has an imperative for taking Pratyaksha seriously in its theology. Chaitanya Vaishnavas are committed to a philosophical view that affirms the reality of the phenomenal world. largely because of the world's availability to sensory experience. I'll repeat this sentence. Chaitanya Vaishnavas are committed to a philosophical view that affirms the reality of the phenomenal world, largely because of the world's availability to sensory experience. The world is Krishna's energy, Shakti, and as such, it is real, eternal, and meaningful. Thus, it is essential that we do not eviscerate that commitment by allowing revelation to suffocate observation. Both can and should coexist in a position of mutual influence and conversation. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the conversation now. We have about 10 minutes.
So, a really impressive talk, and did trigger a lot of thinking amongst the audience, I'm sure about that. There's one question which I felt while you were reading the paper, is that why didn't you touch on the Mimamsa part? The Mimamsa darshan, which gives immense importance to Shabda Pramana. So any specific reason for that, or?
Yeah, definitely Mimamsa would be an important conversation partner here. It's just that for Jiva Goswami and for the early Chaitanya Vaishnavas in general, the Purva Mimamsa is not a major player in their discussions, as in Jiva has very little to say about Purva Mimamsa, and really Jiva in particular agrees with Ramanuja's understanding of Purva Mimamsa as being essentially a precursor to Uttara Mimamsa, and therefore not rejected, but at the same time, sort of when someone gets content, satisfied, exasperated with karma and karma kanda and the performance of karma and the Vedic ritual and so on, then they can journey to Uttara Mimamsa for the sake of gaining knowledge. So it's seen as a precursor. The tools of Mimamsa are used by Jiva. So for example, he uses the Shad Tatparya Linga, a six-part, understanding of meaning. But even that he draws from earlier Vedantists. So he's not really concerned at this historical moment with dealing with Purva Mimamsa, largely because I think those debates had been dealt with earlier by earlier Vedantists, and they're not crucial in Jiva's historical moments at this point anymore.
Yeah.
I think adding to Madhvi's thing, Dr. Gupta, the hermeneutical aspect of it is what I would have appreciated if that can be taken up. I know that Jiva has not concentrated on it because his whole attention was somewhere very different. But you have done a lot of hermeneutical understanding and relooking of that factor. I think for that sake, Purva Mimamsa could have helped you, because there are a lot of good yardstick given, which even the later Bhakti cult people have used it. But a very wonderful, insightful paper. Thank you so much. I'm a little curious to ask Graham, Shri, Madhvi, can I?
Yes, sure.
Just curious, because the wonderful presentation that you had, Graham Shri, phenomenal. I appreciate, or rather salute you for your entire understanding of the Gita and the whole thing. I'm a little curious that when did you get this idea of literally plunging into Gita so much so that you are able to get the essence of it, so much so that I can feel every cell of it in your body is able to reverberate the thoughts of what Krishna has said, and that was phenomenal. Again, my salutations to you. When did you get this idea at all? Not as an academician, but I think all three of you have been so much close to the Bhakti. It has to somewhere begin with when we own it up as our own, and that's where your feeling of oneness and that feeling of identity, the feeling of getting into a very beautiful experience, very ecstatic. Because I have been working very closely on Madhusudan Saraswati's Bhakti Rasayana, I've also translated it into English, which very close, within a few days I'll be actually publishing it. But I was happy that somewhere the devotion part of it has come out very well. So I was a little curious about it, Shweg.
Yes. Well, thank you for your appreciations. I have been reading the Bhagavad Gita now for, if I can count that high, I think around 55 years. So, but it wasn't until I had to translate it that for publication, reading it and reading it in the original is fine, but you don't, when you have to publish it, we all know what it's like. It's worse than written in stone, because the stones don't get duplicated. Books get duplicated over and over, and they go everywhere. So I was discouraged reading the many of the commentaries to the Gita, only because I felt the commentaries were going to the Gita as a kind of buffet, and if you ever go to a buffet, you take what you like and you leave what you don't. And Shankaracharya does this. And I was particularly disappointed when Shankaracharya doesn't make any comment, no bhashya, for that chapter 7, verse 24, I think is vyaktam vyaktim apanam manyante mama buddhiha. I mean, this just completely dismantles his philosophy. So, I mean, you'd hope there would be some sort of defense, but he just chooses to ignore it. So I figured, let me put aside even my preferences. Let me see if the Gita tells us how it wants to be interpreted. And lo and behold, Krishna's last words to Arjuna tell us, have you heard this whole teaching with thought focused on the single highest point? So I'm thinking, well, what is the single highest point? And so, and let me understand everything else in the Gita according to that single highest, ekagra, right? Ekagra, single highest point. Apologies, my daughter is texting me like crazy with her new son. So anyway,
fine.
We're new grandparents over here. Anyway, the point is that this is what drove me, honestly, since you asked.
Beautiful.
And I was going up to Georgetown University for 10 years, presenting the Gita in a course every year. And the professor there, with whom I'm good friends, we would argue back and forth. He would argue the Advaitin position, I'd argue the Dvaitin position, and we'd go back and forth. And the kids, of course, loved seeing it. Then he retired, and then 2 years ago, he wrote to me and said, Graham, I was rereading your Gita and your interpretation, and he said, I think you nailed it. I can't tell you how pleased I was for the whole day.
Elated.
Yeah, very elated.
I'm
yes.
a passionate Advaitin, by the way.
Yeah.
Still.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. I have a quick question for Keo.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, this is just a quick technical question. I think I heard you say the early modern era, referring to the early Chaitanya theologians and philosophers, right?
Yes, basically early modern period for me is like, I guess, 15th century onwards up to, 18th century. So I'm mainly thinking about the Chaitanya theologians.
I never heard that designation, early modern period. Usually isn't it referred to the
pre-modern?
The medieval period.
Medieval.
Even though that's the medieval period. Even though medieval in the West is much earlier.
Early.
The medieval period.
Okay.
So I was
Sure. Yeah. I guess, but then I do think that the early modern period, to refer to that period as early modern, I think is is practiced, and especially I'm thinking of these authors like Sheldon Pollock and others who discuss like a pre-colonial period.
It's a little related term.
So pre-colonial period, meaning like I think they're mainly thinking about like 15th century through mid 18th century, something like that.
Yeah, I think I might prefer that designation than pre-modern. I think I don't know. You may want to consider. I'm not sure, but I'll think about it. I'll think about it too.
Sure.
Yeah. Very good. But thank you for your paper, though. It's excellent. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I had a sort of many questions, but may I sort of raise one question each to my colleagues, Professor Schweig and
yes, please.
Professor Gupta. So first to Professor Schweig, since you presented earlier. This Dharma Kshetra, Kurukshetra, that's and then your interpretation that the Dharma sort of referring to the sort of our real nature, and Kuru in Kurukshetra as kind of referring to potentially our conditioned nature. That's interesting interpretation I never thought of. But then also, like grammatically speaking, I suppose Dharma Kshetra Kurukshetra is a field of Kuru, which is the field of Dharma. So in that sense, how does it work out in your interpretation? So then in a way, ultimately, is our conditioned nature, which is represented by the word Kuru, is our real nature that is represented by Dharma? Is that so kind of kind of dismantling the duality of Kuru and Dharma? Is that the point of Gita according to your reading?
Good. You're making me think about this a little bit more. I mean, so the idea of kshetra, as you well know, is it's spoken of in chapter 13. Kshetra as a sphere of awareness. Okay, literally field, right? But it's a kind of a limits of consciousness or awareness, and when we as human beings are speaking from a conditioned place, then that field is very narrow, and to overcome that and transcend that, I think the teachings of the Gita really speak to really a Dharma Kshetra, right? And a field in which, Dharma Kshetra, okay, in which we can really perceive much more. Ultimately, to even give up Dharma, to relinquish Dharma, all forms of Dharma, because love doesn't have any boundaries at all. So that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. But I love the way the Gita, see, my point, Kyo, was the Gita's genius is the way it just immediately presents the human condition, as opposed to the Quran and the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, which is, the divinity identified, divine actions, divine attributes, all that just gets front loaded to these other texts. But the Gita begins with like, what's going on in this battlefield, right? Okay, so I mean, it's like really kind of very, very straight to the point. And divinity is disclosed gradually to Arjuna. And it shows a very gentle introduction of divinity to a troubled, conditioned situation.
So then, so in that case, like the Kuru Kshetra, the sort of conditioned nature is kind of expanded and transformed by the Dharma. So it's like a Dharma Kshetra, Kuru Kshetra. This imposition of Dharma with Kuru is more sort of development or transformation, perhaps. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I like the way you're thinking about it. I love the tension set right at the start. Right at the start.
I heard a scholar saying, kshetre kshetre dharmam kuru.
Oh.
You can think on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Okay, so
Yeah.
may I have another question to Dr. Gupta, if it's okay? Yeah, so thank you for your fascinating presentation. I mean, this tension between Shabda and Pratyaksha, I think that's a very important topic, which also other scholars dealt with. But then sort of the way you're kind of dealing with in a constructive way, sort of first, this is, I guess, maybe more like comment, sort of reminded me of liberation theology, and then how, liberation theology kind of starts with the situatedness of the believer, the context, historical situation, political context, and so on, and then sort of reads the Bible with that situatedness, and then try to kind of construct the meaningfulness out of Bible, and then sort of construct the meaningful engaging tradition out of the text. So there is a kind of perpetual engagement between the sort of historical situation and the text, which sort of guarantees the kind of renewal of the tradition and continuity of the tradition. So just I thought this the point and what you're trying to do with the Jiva sort of perhaps has some parallel with the way liberation theology approaches to the scripture. Anyway, so that's my comment. But then just one question I had, and many questions I had, but then one point that you mentioned this example, pain of fire is healed by the heat of fire. And that was perhaps given as one of the example potentially contradicting our sort of common experience. And I wasn't quite sure how, because I think you were using that example as within the context of how, Shabda and the Pratyaksha eventually sort of merges in a congruent, in a harmonious manner. But then I wasn't able to see how that particular example kind of merges harmoniously. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you, first of all, for your earlier comment about beginning with the situatedness of the reader as a starting point. I think you've expressed it well, and certainly the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition has a lot of work to do in terms of thinking about our place in the world in relation to scripture and bringing those things together. So that was the intent in terms of trying to reread Jiva, not merely in light of the discussions that he's engaged in, but also in light of our own place in the world today, our own moment. So thank you for that. And the other thing is that if you have other sources in mind where the conflict between Shabda and Pratyaksha is worked out, I would be grateful if you could send me some references offline. That would be very helpful as well. And also to Dr. Madhavi and Dr. Uma Shankar, Professor Shankar, if there's specific sources that you have in mind for drawing from Mimamsa theology for that broader context of Mimamsa hermeneutics, please send them my way. And I'm always grateful. One of my goals with this presentation is to receive feedback for further areas of development. So this is quite useful. So that's to everyone's comments and that request, in case you have more you can provide. Now, in terms of your question, Jiva in that section, from what I recall, gives two examples. One is the poison example, where the doctor relieves poison, and then even though the pain of the poison is still present. And that one is the clearer example of Shabda and Pratyaksha eventually becoming congruent with each other, because one would hope that the patient does not die from that poison, despite the doctor's claims that it's out. One would, in that case, question the doctor, not the patient, but merely that the patient's experience is slightly delayed, that Pratyaksha is delayed in reaching congruence with Shabda. The heat being a burn being counteracted by heat. So there's kind of a general sort of Ayurvedic principle of the idea that a negative element can be counteracted by that same element. So thorn can be removed by a thorn. Poison can be counteracted by an antidote that is made of poison itself. And heat can be counteracted by the application of heat. And so there's that general principle. Now, whether or not that would work in today's medical understanding, as in whether or not a doctor today would characterize a cure from a burn in that way, I think the intent at that time, in Jiva's time, is very much the same, as in what he's talking about is medical knowledge that is reliable. And presumably, through the application of heat, in the mind of Jiva and the Ayurvedic writings of the time, through a certain application of further heat, one can relieve the symptoms of earlier heat pain. So the idea is that it is meant to be a genuine cure, and therefore Shabda and Pratyaksha are likely to become congruent again, even in that example. That example is a tougher one for us today because we would not characterize the medical solution in that way. We might even reject it. But given Jiva's context and in his time, I think the point is essentially the same, that eventually the patient will feel relief from that difficulty. What I would like to do further, and this is something I've not done, is dive deeper into the Ayurvedic background of these specific examples, because like I said, it seems very fascinating and not at all a coincidence that the majority of examples that Jiva gives in relation to Shabda have to do with medical texts. And so I would like to get into these medical texts a little more closely so that I can look specifically at what this example is describing, the application of heat, for example, or of poison, because my guess is that these are not obscure examples that Jiva is giving. They're like his other examples. All the examples he gives, even from the Vedas, are very standard examples. And so there's probably good precedent to get into the exact medical knowledge that informs the answer. So this is a general answer to your question, Kyo, but I think a more specific answer is warranted in terms of how exactly the application of heat works, and therefore what Jiva assumes that the reader will know when he gives that example.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that perhaps you want to dig into Ayurvedic text, and then probably when Jiva says that the pain of heat is healed by the another type of heat, or I don't perhaps that knowledge is not to be understood in the sense of like heating up the burn with another fire. Perhaps some other medical ingredients that's considered to contain the element of fire in some ways, but not really like.
It could very well refer to a fever as well, as well as to the production of heat as a result of eating certain foods. So in Ayurvedic knowledge, certain foods are considered to be heaty.
Sure.
As a result of that heat, it generates heat, which leads to all kinds of conditions, such as skin problems, the presence of pimples and warts on the body, and fevers. And so, if for example, a pimple on the body is an element of the production of too much heat in the body, then sometimes burning that growth can be an application of heat that then wards off the excess of heat. So you're right, Kyo. There's a lot of possibilities in terms of what the presence of heat means, not just in terms of further burning a burn. I think that would be very counterintuitive.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Madhvi, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. So So, madam, will you propose a vote of thanks?
Okay.
Uma, madam?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It gives me immense pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to three most engaging lectures that we had today: Gramshwig, Kiyasko Gita, and Ravi Gupta. As I was discussing with you all, it has been a beautiful experience of going inward. There are a lot of engagement that we could have it, and it has also opened up vistas of new research areas. I'm happy to meet all of you, and I think I got your emails. We'll stay connected. I think we can take it further in our and exchange a lot of ideas that we have. And this CHPS is center that we have launched today is going to be the fulcrum through which we'll be able to connect a lot of scholars across the globe. I very much thankful to all three of you, especially Gupta. I think woke you up very early today morning, but having a good day, you started off with a wonderful lecture, and all three of you a wonderful time that we had. And thank you so much, and we shall stay connected to it. To the audience and the YouTube viewers, tomorrow morning this technical session will begin, and the host will take it over. Thank you, and good night to each one of you.
Thank you. And congratulations on your new center.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Madhvi, I think all of us can leave, and
Yeah,
I'll end
we
the
will.
program. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
Professor Shankar.
Yeah, tell me.
Professor Shankar, yes, thank you. Well, you just mentioned that you finished English translation of Madhusudana's Bhakti Rasayana.
Yeah.
I am in fact very interested in your translation. So because
Just
I
gone for the print, Gita, and I'm just waiting for the ISBN number. I thought I'll just maybe I'll definitely send you a soft copy first, and maybe later on.
yeah
Then I
maybe
would
maybe I just text message you. Can you
Okay.
maybe give me your email address so that I
Sure.
can
UMAS. Shall I?
maybe
UMAS.
can you maybe type your email address in the chat?
I'll do that. I'll do that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. And so that we can exchange. And I'm very interested in the
I'll be
sort of
happy for your comments actually.
Madhusudana's engagement with the rasa theory. So thank you. This is wonderful. Okay, so let us keep in touch.
Oh, sure, definitely. Thank you all. I'm ending this program for today. It's been a long day for us. Madhvi, we can end, right?